My company had sent me to this remote location for a routine inspection, and although I'd done this job countless times before, something about this place made me uneasy. The drive into the city had been long and monotonous, passing through miles of empty countryside before the skyline of crumbling buildings came into view. A thick fog clung to the streets, blanketing everything in a murky haze that seemed almost unnatural. I work as an inspector for a large logistics company. My job is simple: check on the warehouses, ensure the transports go smoothly, and make sure everything is in order. I've been to plenty of cities, most of them run down and struggling. But this one had an oppressive atmosphere I couldn't quite shake. The company rarely sent inspectors to the same location twice, so I wasn't familiar with this city or its inhabitants. That anonymity usually worked in my favor. No one knew me, and I could get my job done without interference. Yet, here, the anonymity felt more like isolation. I drove through the fog-shrouded streets toward the warehouse. The roads were unusually empty, not a single pedestrian in sight. Most of the streetlights were dim, their light barely piercing the mist that curled around every corner. The buildings I passed seemed old and abandoned, their facades worn and cracked, as if they'd seen decades of neglect. This was the kind of city that had a history, and not a good one. After navigating through a maze of narrow streets, I finally arrived at the warehouse. It stood on the outskirts of the city, isolated and looming against the backdrop of thick fog. The building was large, with high walls of corrugated metal stained with rust. There was something about its silhouette that made it look more like a fortress than a storage facility. It was almost as if the warehouse itself was keeping something inside, or keeping something out. I parked my car in the lot and took a moment to gather my thoughts. I'd be here for the next 3 days, conducting inspections and checking on incoming deliveries. It was supposed to be a straightforward job, in and out. Yet as I stared at the warehouse, a chill ran down my spine. "All right, let's get this over with," I muttered to myself, stepping out of the car. The fog wrapped around me like a damp blanket, and the air smelled of rust and decay. As I approached the entrance, the warehouse manager emerged to greet me. He was a wiry man with a nervous demeanor, his eyes darting around as if he was constantly watching for something. "Welcome, Inspector," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We've been expecting you." "Thanks," I replied, extending my hand. He shook it with a clammy grip, then quickly withdrew his hand as though my touch had burned him. "Let's make this quick," he continued, glancing over his shoulder at the warehouse. "I'll show you around, and then you can start your inspection." He led me through the large metal doors into the warehouse. The interior was dimly lit, with rows of stacked crates stretching into the distance. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of dust and something else I couldn't quite identify. We walked past aisles of crates marked with various labels, some familiar and others written in languages I didn't recognize. "So, is there anything I need to be aware of?" I asked, trying to break the silence that hung heavy in the air. The manager hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Not really. We just get our shipments, store them, and ship them out. Your job is to make sure everything's in order, right?" "Right," I replied. But his vague response only added to my suspicion. He seemed tense, almost as if he was hiding something. As we continued through the warehouse, I noticed small details that set me on edge. Some of the crates had strange markings etched into their surfaces, symbols I couldn't identify. The lights flickered occasionally, casting eerie shadows that made the corners of the building feel much darker than they should have. I chalked it up to the building's age and poor maintenance, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind told me otherwise. We reached the far end of the warehouse, where a large hatch was set into the floor. I stared at it for a moment, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. "That's just an old storage basement," the manager said quickly, noticing my gaze. "It's off limits, not in use anymore." "Got it," I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than he was letting on. After a brief tour, The manager left me to my inspection. I walked the aisles, clipboard in hand, making notes and checking off items as I went. At first glance, everything seemed fine. The inventory matched up, the crates were stacked as they should be, and there was no sign of any tampering. Yet, as I continued, I couldn't ignore the small, unsettling things that happened around me. There was a faint rustling noise coming from somewhere above, like the sound of fabric being dragged across the metal rafters. I looked up, but the dim lights revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, only to return to stillness when I turned my head. The air grew colder the further I walked, and I found myself rubbing my arms to ward off the chill. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease building inside me. It's just an old building, I told myself. Old buildings make noises. With the inspection completed, I stepped outside, inhaling deeply to clear my mind. The fog had grown thicker, swirling around the warehouse like a living thing. I glanced back at the building one last time before getting into my car and heading back to the apartment I had rented for my stay. The drive through the city was unnervingly quiet. Not a single car passed me, and the buildings loomed in the mist like silent sentinels. My apartment was on the outskirts of the city, just a few blocks from the warehouse. It was a modest place, sparsely furnished, but it would serve its purpose for the next couple of days. Inside, I set my things down and tried to relax. I poured myself a glass of water and sat by the window, looking out at the fog-draped city. A sense of dread hung over me, and I couldn't pinpoint its source. Was it the warehouse? The manager's strange behavior? Or was it something else, something lurking just beyond the fog? As I sat there, I began to hear faint noises from outside. Nothing distinct, just a murmur carried by the wind. The sound set my nerves on edge, but I forced myself to ignore it. I needed sleep, I told myself. Tomorrow was another day, and I had more inspections to conduct. I pulled the curtains shut, blocking out the sight of the foggy streets, and lay down on the bed. But even as I closed my eyes, the feeling of being watched lingered in the darkness, refusing to let me rest. That night, my dreams were filled with shadows and whispers. I woke up with a start, heart pounding and drenched in sweat. For a moment, I wasn't sure where I was. Then the memories of the previous day came rushing back. The warehouse, the manager's cryptic behavior, the fog-filled streets. I sat up in bed, rubbing my temples as I tried to shake off the lingering sense of unease. It was still early morning, though the light outside was dull and lifeless, filtered through the ever-present mist that seemed to suffocate the city. I glanced at my phone, checking for messages or updates from the company. Nothing. I had the entire day ahead of me before tonight's inspection, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping dread at the thought of returning to the warehouse. I decided to get out of the apartment and explore the city, hoping that keeping myself busy might help push away the unease. After a quick breakfast, I headed outside, pulling my jacket tighter around me as the damp cold settled into my bones. The streets were as empty as they had been the day before, the fog still clinging stubbornly to the asphalt. Walking down the narrow streets, I noticed how quiet everything was. Not just the lack of cars or people, but an actual absence of sound. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was as if the city was holding its breath. I passed several shops with closed signs hanging on their doors, their interiors dark and uninviting. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. But when I turned to look, there was nothing, just the fog swirling ever so slightly. My exploration eventually led me to a small diner nestled between two crumbling buildings. A bell above the door jingled as I pushed it open, and a wave of warmth greeted me, along with the smell of stale coffee and greasy food. The place was nearly empty, save for a couple of locals sitting at the counter and a waitress standing behind it, cleaning a glass with a stained rag. I took a seat at one of the booths near the window. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, walked over and handed me a menu. "Morning," she said in a tone that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "What can I get you?" I glanced at the menu, not really hungry, but figuring I should order something. "Just coffee and a sandwich, thanks." She nodded and walked back to the counter. I gazed out the window, watching the fog swirl and shift. It was almost hypnotic the way it moved, as if something inside it was alive. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. When the waitress returned with my order, I decided to take a chance at getting some information. "So, I'm new in town," I began casually, stirring sugar into my coffee. "Just here for work. What can you tell me about this place?" She gave me a long, hard look, her expression unreadable. "Not much to tell," she replied finally. "Quiet town, not much happens here." I raised an eyebrow, sensing that she was holding something back. "I'm actually inspecting a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It seems off. Can't quite put my finger on it, though." She paused, her hand stopping mid-wipe on the counter. The couple of patrons at the counter exchanged a glance, but remained silent. The atmosphere in the diner grew tense, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. "The warehouse, huh?" she said slowly, her voice low. "You're better off not sticking your nose too deep into things that don't concern you." The cryptic response sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean by that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a whisper. "People around here don't talk about it. About the warehouse, the outskirts, the things people see." She glanced over her shoulder, as if making sure no one was listening. "Just mind your business and do your job, and leave as soon as you can." I stared at her, a sinking feeling settling in my gut. Before I could press for more information, she straightened up, her face returning to that neutral, disinterested mask. "Your food's getting cold," she said, turning away and walking back to the counter. I sat there for a moment, processing her words. The warehouse, the outskirts, things people see. What the hell was going on in this town? I glanced over at the patrons at the counter, hoping they might offer some insight, but they avoided eye contact, staring intently into their coffee cups. I forced down a few bites of my sandwich, the taste of cardboard and grease mixing with my anxiety. When I couldn't stand the silence any longer, I paid for my meal and left the diner, stepping back out into the cold, fog-laden streets. As I walked aimlessly through the city, I replayed the conversation with the waitress in my mind. There was something more going on here, something dark and unexplainable. My job was simple: inspect the warehouse and ensure the deliveries went smoothly. But now my curiosity was piqued, and with it came a sense of danger. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I pulled it out and saw a message from the warehouse manager. "No transport tonight," it read. "Thick mist. Stay at your apartment until further notice." I frowned. That didn't make sense. The mist had been here since I arrived, so why suddenly cancel tonight's transport? As much as I wanted to brush it off as a logistical issue, the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. This was not a mere weather concern. With no reason to go to the warehouse that night, I decided to head back to my apartment. The walk back was as unnerving as before, with the fog seeming to close in around me, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I quickened my pace, the chill of the air seeping into my bones. When I finally reached the apartment building, I hesitated for a moment before going inside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the shadows stretching long and dark along the floor. Back in my room, I threw my coat on the chair and went to the window, peering out into the street below. The mist seemed even thicker now, swirling and shifting like a living entity. I glanced at my watch. It was only early evening, but the darkness outside made it look like midnight. Then, movement caught my eye. At the edge of the building across the street, I saw it. A long shadow, humanoid in shape but stretched and distorted, flickering in and out of the fog. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, unable to look away. The shadow moved, its shape shifting unnaturally, growing taller and then shrinking, as if it were testing the limits of its form. "What the hell?" I whispered, my hands gripping the windowsill. Was I imagining this? Was it a trick of the light, or perhaps just my mind playing tricks on me? Before I could make sense of what I was seeing, a noise pierced the silence. Muffled murmurs. It was coming from the hallway outside my door, from the walls, from everywhere. The murmurs grew louder, filling the room with an unsettling hum that made my skin crawl. I felt trapped, cornered, and utterly helpless. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the sounds and shadows. Then, in a moment of sheer desperation, I rushed to the entrance door and threw it open. The noises stopped. The hallway was empty, but my eyes widened in horror at what I saw. A thick layer of ash coated the floor, swirling in small eddies as the cold draft from my open door swept through the corridor. Footprints, bare footprints, were pressed into the ash, leading directly to my door. And then they stopped, as if whatever made them had vanished right there, outside my apartment. I staggered back, slamming the door shut. My hands shook, my heart thudded painfully in my chest. This was no trick of my mind, no figment of my imagination. Something was happening in this city, something I didn't understand, and it was getting closer. I couldn't sleep. I spent the night sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the door as if it might burst open at any moment. My mind was racing, replaying the events in the hallway and the shadows I'd seen outside my window. I felt as though the city itself was closing in on me, its misty grip tightening around my sanity. The noises returned intermittently, whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. They emanated from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. I strained to catch the words, but they remained an unintelligible murmur, like a conversation just out of earshot. Occasionally, I would hear a faint banging, causing me to jump and my heart to skip a beat. I glanced at my watch. The hands crept closer to dawn, the hours dragging on in a slow, agonizing crawl. Exhaustion weighed on my eyelids, but the fear coursing through my veins kept me on high alert. I couldn't tell if the whispers and sounds were real or just a product of my unraveling mind. Eventually, the faintest hint of light began to seep through the drawn curtains. The whispers gradually faded, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, if only slightly. The city's misty grip seemed to loosen with the arrival of daylight. I collapsed onto the bed, my body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been building all night. When I awoke, it was late afternoon. The room was dim, the light outside still shrouded by the ever-present fog. I groaned as I sat up, my body aching from the tension of the previous night. My eyes felt dry and gritty, and a dull headache pounded at the base of my skull. I checked my phone. No messages, no updates, just silence from the warehouse and my company. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. My last inspection was scheduled for tonight, and despite every fiber of my being screaming at me to leave this city immediately, I knew I had to go through with it. It was my job, after all. Just one more night, I told myself. One more inspection, and then I could get out of here. I forced myself to get ready, throwing on a clean shirt and grabbing my jacket. As I left the apartment, I paused at the door, staring down at the ash that still coated the hallway floor. The footprints were gone, but the faint dusting of ash remained, an eerie reminder of the previous night's events. I hurried out of the building, not daring to look back. The city's secrets. I decided to spend the remaining daylight hours exploring the city, hoping to find some answers, or at least distract myself from the impending inspection. The mist clung to the streets, swirling around my legs as I walked, a silent companion to my growing unease. After wandering aimlessly for a while, I found myself standing in front of a dilapidated library. Its windows were covered in grime, and the paint on the wooden sign was peeling, but something about the place called to me. I pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. the musty scent of old paper and dust greeting me. The interior was dimly lit, with rows of bookshelves casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. At the far end of the room, an elderly woman sat behind a small desk, her gray hair tied up in a loose bun. She glanced up as I approached, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice raspy with age. "Maybe," I replied hesitantly. "I'm just passing through, here for work. I was wondering if you could tell me anything about this city, its history, or the warehouse on the outskirts." Her expression darkened at the mention of the warehouse, and she leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "The city has its secrets," she said slowly. "Not all of them pleasant. People disappear, especially around the outskirts. They say it's the mist that takes them, or something inside it." I shivered involuntarily, her words hitting a little too close to the experiences I'd been having. "What about the warehouse?" I pressed, trying to keep my voice steady. "The warehouse has always been there," she continued, her eyes never leaving mine. "Even before the city grew around it. It was built on cursed ground, some say. Others claim it was never built at all, that it simply appeared one day." She paused, her gaze growing distant. "The workers you see there, they aren't like you and me. They're bound to that place, part of its darkness. Best to stay away, young man. Stay away from the warehouse and the things that move within the mist." I nodded, a cold dread settling over me. This woman spoke as if she knew exactly what was happening, but her words only deepened the mystery. I thanked her and left the library, her warnings echoing in my mind. The final night at the warehouse. It was dusk by the time I arrived back at my apartment. I had an hour before my final inspection, and my nerves were frayed. I considered calling my company, telling them that something was wrong, that I couldn't go through with it. But I knew it was pointless. This was my job. I had to see it through. The drive to the warehouse felt longer than usual, the road stretching out before me like an endless path into darkness. The mist thickened as I approached the outskirts, the streetlights casting a dim, flickering glow that barely penetrated the murk. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, eyes peering at me from the shadows lining the road. When the warehouse finally loomed into view, a new wave of dread washed over me. I parked the car, taking a deep breath to steady myself. "Just one more inspection," I muttered under my breath. "Then I'm done." The transport truck arrived shortly after I did, rumbling into the parking lot and stopping with a shudder. As the driver and workers disembarked, I immediately felt something was off. They moved strangely, their limbs jerky and stiff as if they were marionettes controlled by invisible strings. Their faces were obscured by shadows, eyes glinting dimly in the faint light. A chill ran down my spine. I watched as they began unloading crates, their movements mechanical and unsettling. One of the workers stood apart from the others, half hidden in the shadowy corner of the warehouse. His eyes glowed faintly, staring at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. I glanced away, trying to focus on my clipboard, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Then, the banging started again. The same banging I had heard on the first night, now echoing through the warehouse. It came from the back, where the hatch was. I felt my pulse quicken, a voice in my head screaming at me to leave, to run. But I couldn't. I had to finish this inspection. I had to know what was happening here. I approached the hatch, my footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. The banging ceased as I got closer, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the latch. I didn't want to open it, but something compelled me, some force that pushed me forward despite the terror building inside me. With a shaky breath, I grasped the handle and pulled. The hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was cold and stale, carrying with it a foul stench that made my stomach turn. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom as I began my descent. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the air grew colder. I reached the bottom of the stairs, finding myself in a long, narrow hallway lined with open entryways. A faint murmuring sound filled the space, an incoherent jumble of voices whispering from all directions. I crept forward, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. As I neared one of the entryways, a putrid smell hit me, and I gagged, fighting the urge to vomit. The murmuring grew louder, almost like a chant. I shone the flashlight into the room and froze, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, a figure crouched in the corner, its limbs contorted in unnatural ways. Its back was arched, spine jutting out like a grotesque sculpture, and its pale skin gleamed dully in the flashlight's beam. It stood on all fours, head hanging low, and made soft, murmuring sounds, almost as if it were speaking to itself. My mind reeled, trying to process what I was seeing. Then, with a slow, jerking motion, the creature turned its head toward me. Its face was hollow, a void where eyes and mouth should be. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but no sound came out. The creature began to move toward me, its limbs twisting and snapping with each step. Panic surged through me, and in a frantic rush, I turned and bolted back toward the stairs. I could hear it behind me, galloping like some twisted beast. The sound filled my ears, drowning out everything else. I reached the stairs and scrambled up, nearly slipping in my haste. I could feel the creature's presence behind me, getting closer and closer. With a final burst of adrenaline, I lunged out of the hatch, slamming it shut behind me just as something crashed into it from the other side. I collapsed onto the warehouse floor, gasping for breath. My heart pounded so violently that I feared it might burst. The banging on the hatch ceased, and an eerie silence fell over the warehouse. I glanced around, expecting to see the workers staring at me, but they were gone. I lay on the warehouse floor, gasping for breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What was that thing? How had it been in the basement all this time, and why had the workers vanished? I felt dizzy, on the verge of losing control. I needed to get out of here, now. Struggling to my feet, I staggered toward the main entrance, my legs weak and unsteady. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to flee, to put as much distance between myself and this cursed place as possible. The hatch behind me remained silent, but I couldn't help but feel eyes on me, unseen eyes watching from every corner of the warehouse. I reached the main door and pushed it open, stumbling into the cool night air. The fog was thick, swirling around my feet as I crossed the parking lot to my car. My hands were shaking so badly that it took several tries to get the key into the ignition. I turned it, and the engine roared to life, the sound a comforting reminder of reality in this nightmare. Come on, I muttered, shifting the car into gear. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced at the warehouse one last time. For a split second I saw them, the workers, standing in the shadows by the warehouse's edge. Their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, fixated on me. Then, they faded into the fog, becoming one with the mist that surrounded the building. I gritted my teeth and floored the gas pedal, tearing away from the warehouse and onto the deserted road. The city loomed ahead, shrouded in darkness and mist, its streets twisting and winding like a labyrinth designed to trap the unwary. I drove through the fog-choked streets, my pulse racing with the fear of what might be lurking just beyond the headlights. The road out of the city stretched before me, a narrow path bordered by tall, dark buildings that seemed to lean in on me as I drove. The mist thickened, and shadows danced at the periphery of my vision, shapes flickering in and out of the fog like specters haunting my escape. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, the car surging forward as if it too wanted to break free of the city's grasp. I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw them, pairs of glowing eyes staring out from the shadows that clung to the buildings. They moved, shifting positions, as if following my car's every move. A chill ran down my spine, and I forced my eyes back to the road. "Focus. Just keep driving," I whispered to myself. I gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, willing myself to ignore the flickering movements in the fog around me. The road narrowed as I drove further away from the warehouse, the mist clinging to the car, wrapping it in a suffocating embrace. The headlights barely cut through the gloom, casting long, distorted shadows on the pavement ahead. After what felt like an eternity of driving, I spotted a faint glow in the distance, a gas station, its neon sign flickering through the mist like a beacon. Relief washed over me. I needed to gather my thoughts, calm down, and figure out what to do next. My mouth was dry, and my hands trembled from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I pulled into the gas station lot and parked near the entrance. The place was eerily quiet, the dim lights casting an unsettling glow on the deserted pumps. I stepped out of the car, my legs weak and unsteady, and made my way inside. The interior of the gas station was as dismal as the exterior. Shelves stocked with snacks and drinks lined the walls, and the faint hum of a refrigerator filled the air. Behind the counter stood a lone clerk, a middle-aged man with deep-set eyes and an unnerving smile that seemed plastered onto his face. His eyes tracked me as I walked in, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Hey there," he said in a raspy voice as I approached the counter. "Rough night?" I forced a nod, too shaken to form coherent words. I grabbed a bottle of water from a nearby cooler and approached the counter, fumbling for my wallet. The clerk watched me silently, that eerie smile never wavering. His gaze was piercing, as if he could see right through me, into the fear that was clawing at my insides. I managed to find a few coins and set them on the counter. "Here," I muttered, avoiding his eyes. The clerk took the coins, his fingers brushing against mine, cold and dry like old parchment. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You should get back in your car. Quickly." I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" His eyes flickered toward the windows, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. "You didn't leave them behind," he said, his voice barely audible. "They're still following you." A wave of terror surged through me. I turned my head slowly toward the windows, peering out into the mist. At first I saw nothing, just the fog swirling under the dim lights of the gas station. But then, faintly, I heard it. The murmur, the whispering. It was coming from the edges of the darkness, the same sound I had heard in the apartment hallway and the warehouse basement. The clerk's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. "You need to run, now." Adrenaline surged through me, and I wrenched my arm free, stumbling back toward the door. I threw it open and dashed outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder. I glanced to my left, and that's when I saw it. Emerging from the fog, galloping toward me, was the creature. Its body twisted grotesquely, limbs bent at impossible angles, its spine arched upward. Its face was a hollow, featureless, fixed on me with a hunger that defied understanding. I let out a strangled scream and dove into my car, slamming the door shut. My hands were shaking so violently that I fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them. I managed to jam them into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas pedal. The tires screeched as the car shot forward, tearing out of the gas station lot and back onto the road. I drove blindly, not caring where I was going, as long as it was away from that thing. The headlights cut through the fog, the road ahead blurring as I sped down the narrow path, the engine roaring in my ears. I pushed the car to its limit, the speedometer climbing higher as I gripped the steering wheel with sweaty palms. The whispers persisted, seeping into the car from all sides, from everywhere. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a reminder that I was still alive, for now. I glanced in the rear-view mirror, but all I saw was fog, thick and unending. I drove for what felt like hours, the road stretching endlessly before me. Slowly, however, I began to notice a change. The fog ahead was thinning, the road widening, and the oppressive darkness was giving way to a faint glow in the distance. I pressed on, hope rising within me like a flicker of light in a sea of shadows. The headlights illuminated a sign up ahead: city limits. Relief flooded through me. I was leaving that cursed city behind. I sped up, eager to put as much distance between myself and the warehouse as possible. I don't know how long I drove before I finally felt safe enough to slow down. I pulled off the road into a small clearing and parked the car, my hands still trembling. I sat there for a long moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear, star-filled sky above. My heart was still pounding and my mind reeled from the night's events. The whispers, the workers, the creature in the basement. I had escaped it, but at what cost? I didn't even know what I had witnessed. All I knew was that I never wanted to go back. I reached for my phone and saw it was almost dead, the battery icon flashing red. I turned it on to check the time, 5:17 a.m. I had been driving for hours, fueled solely by fear and adrenaline. I let out a shaky breath and leaned back in my seat, trying to calm my racing thoughts. A sense of quiet relief washed over me, like I had crossed some invisible boundary that separated that city from the rest of the world. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of hope. As the sun began to rise, I couldn't help but laugh a little, a sound that felt foreign in the quiet car. I glanced at my hands on the steering wheel. They had stopped shaking. By the time I reached the next town, everything felt strangely normal again. I pulled into a diner, grabbed a cup of coffee, and listened to the morning news on the radio. Life continued around me as if nothing had ever happened. And for a moment I let myself believe that was true. I left that city behind and never looked back.